Welcome to the Musicians Weekly, Volume 30. Music and moral. Basically, there is great music by composers or musicians who are morally very imperfect. And this well know. Nobody would doubt that all people are in some kind of harmony about the idea that Richard Wagner was not such a great being as he was as a composer, an artist, and about many others. I'm not so sure about that, by the way. Of course, we all have these dark sides inside of us. And so to do a judgment is simply the last thing I'm interested in. I would say that it is always an object of study. We look at somebody and we look at the whole person and the whole artist. But also it makes no sense if we don't look at ourselves as a whole person and maybe artist, whatever we are, listener, musician, composer, or whatever. So this is the basic condition to do it in an honest, enlightening, and also competent way. So if you are this kind of critic who simply judges about people who lived in other circumstances at another time, and you take your moral attitude of today, it is nothing else than stupid arrogance. And many people speak like that, for example, about composers from the Third Reich. So I made some research now about one of the more successful composers of the Third Reich, who was a totally anti-Nazi man. His name is Paul Höffer, H-O-2-F-F-E-R. Paul Höffer was born in 1895 in what is today Wuppertal, in North Rhine-Westphalia, and he died in 1949, much earlier than expected and than hoped for, in Berlin. He was a very gifted young man, of course, like many composers, and a very gifted pianist, and started composing when he was something around 11, 12 years old. And he was then in the 1920s a student of Franz Schreker in Berlin. And so he was very much influenced by Schreker. And he wrote some fantastic music, a symphony, a violin concerto, and so on. Lots of works. And then when the time changed quite rapidly during the Weimar Republic period, he understood that we cannot stay with this kind of impressionist, expressionist, late romantic, nostalgic, at that time felt as a nostalgic way of composing. And so he became interested in the new trends and new directions, new horizons. And so at that time, like with Hans Eisler, like with also Paul Hindemith to some degree, with Kurt Weill and so on, there was the idea of a new simplicity and to write for many people, for the masses. It was, of course, a communist idea, but it was also an idea National Socialists took then as soon as they could. It was not their idea, by the way. They were just nationalists, and they were looking with all the admiration to the symbols of Germanic identity like Richard Wagner. Anyhow, Höffer was in this new trend, and then there was another thing that was very important at the time. The name Fritz Jöde is important. There was this singing movement for young people, and so there was also the idea to have German subjects, like in the UK they had English subjects, and there were composers like Vaughan Williams and Gustav Holst who brought forward the English identity of songwriting and so on. And same thing we have in France, we have in Poland, we have in Russia, we have basically in every country, in Czechia and so on. And so they had this idea of a German identity, German popular songs of all time, mainly medieval songs and all these things. So Höffer was also in this stream of going back to the pre-classical time and at the same time opening your stylistic direction to new vistas. With all this kind of harmony that expressionism and so-called Neue Sachlichkeit and new classicity or classicism or whatever, and neoclassicism and all these things were just there. And so he was searching for his own style for many years, and he didn't write so many important pieces in the early 1930s as he had done in the 1920s. And in the second half of the 1930s, he suddenly had the feeling, now I found my style. And so he wrote some fantastic pieces, like the Symphonie der großen Stadt, the Symphony of the Large City, the Piano Concerto, the Stargard festival music. That's very interesting. This he wrote in 1943, and he was, as a prisoner of war, he was in Stargard, in today's Poland, in First World War, in 1918. And so 25 years after that, he wrote a music that would bring him this place, bring this place back to him in a positive way. Of course, in a time which was totally non-positive, we have to say. But this he knew. And then he had also written a cello concerto. He wrote a wonderful third string quartet. The second that he had written in the 20s, the cello concerto he had written in the 20s. And he wrote, after the war, he wrote a serenade for strings and an oboe concerto with string orchestra, which are marvelous music. And he wrote a lot of oratorios, particularly in the last years of the war. So there is the Mystery Love, and there is the Dance of Death, which is also called The Last Hour. And these are particularly moving pieces of great music, really wonderful oratorios on large scale. So he was one of the finest composers of the time, but he is totally unknown today. There only exists a little recording of a wind trio for oboe, clarinet, and bassoon from also the last years, which is a theme with variations, which lasts maybe 7 minutes. So this will not be a really representative picture of him. In the late years, he wrote, for example, also a wind quintet on a theme by Beethoven, which is fantastic, and which amalgamates Beethoven's humorous language, the humorous aspect of his language, with the new tonal language of the time. Anyhow, so all these things he wrote. In the 30s, he had written an opera which is called Der falsche Waldemar, the wrong Waldemar, which was quite successful, but the publisher told him, okay, you only get money after the 25th performance. These were the conditions composers had to live at the time, so it was very difficult to survive as a composer. So he was, of course, also teaching, and he was a teacher many people wanted to study with. And then he was very successful in the Third Reich, because for the Olympic Games in 1936, he wrote a piece called Olympischer Schwur. Now we have to know it's not on a National Socialist text. It's the old Greek text in German. And the music has nothing to do with National Socialism. But of course it was a commission, and he wrote it, and he got, which is singular, an Olympic gold medal for that piece. Now, he was living in very particular circumstances. His father-in-law was Gustav Havemann, a famous violinist, a violin virtuoso, also a bit of a composer, who was a convinced Nazi and was leading the Kampfbund, the fighting association orchestra. And so he always tried to convince him that he should become a member of that. But on the opposite, Höffer didn't even become a party member of the National Socialist Party, which most people did, because that was how they could survive more calmly in these, also for the artists, very difficult times. Then he wrote some of the music was very usable for the Nazis because it was on these old German melodies and some kind of music for everybody, so-called Spielmusik in German. But this was just side production. And so he wrote a lot of youth music also. But he had done that before the Third Reich. So this is not an idea that came up in the Third Reich. And for many composers, it was starting in the end of the 1920s. Like also Heinz Thyssen who was totally anti-Nazi and totally ignored by the regime and ousted. And Thyssen had also begun at the time to write such two-part choral music, which is identical in soprano and tenor and identical in alto and contralto and bass, and these things. One wonderful text by Goethe and by Eichendorff and whatever. Now, Höffer also did these things, and these things the Nazis could use for all these youth organization things and so on. But Höffer's true composer's soul was going to some other things, like the symphony, like the piano concerto and so on, and the oratorios particularly, which were very pacifistic music and which were absolutely not in the interest of the regime. As he did it during the war, and there was nothing festive and optimistic anymore about such music. But now the very interesting thing is that Höffer, who to many people today is a Nazi composer because he simply lived at the time and had some success, Höffer wrote diaries. He wrote diaries in the early 1920s until 1925. Then he stopped writing diaries. He did a lot of composing, and he brought forward his way as a composer and had change of style and all these things. But in 1930, when Hitler came to power, he started writing diary again until the end of his life. And these diaries are testimonials of somebody totally anti-National Socialist. So that is fantastic. These diaries will be published as a complete thing. We will do that within the next years. So these are written in so-called Sütterlin, and so it has to be transcribed into the computer, which somebody very fine for such work will do. And we will then release all the diaries in one volume, which will be quite large. And it will show the picture of a composer who totally opposed the politics, but who had also some views behind the curtain of the power, and who never, ever became a kind of so-called accomplice of these morally horrible things that were going on in these times. But he was there. And it was not only that his father-in-law of his second marriage was a leading Nazi musician. He also had gone to school at the same school, same generation with Joseph Goebbels. And so he had to find a kind of distance to this so-called friendship, which it never was. So for him, Hitler, Goebbels, and all these people were simply monsters. And that is what he writes in his diaries. And this is really courageous because it could happen. It could have happened any time that police would come, Gestapo will come to his home and would find all these things. And they would just have it in his desk. And why do we know that this could have happened? Because as a teacher, we have the testimonials of his pupils. Among them, Dietrich Erdmann, who became a quite well-known composer in Berlin after the war, born in 1917. And Dietrich Erdmann writes that they were also, all of these close pupils were in fear for Höffer because he so openly said what he thought. And so he was the only person they knew in the whole field of culture who would speak the truth about it. And so we have here a real person of inner exile, of inner migration. And I wouldn't call it a hero, but a person with a real backbone and with real principles. And now we have the fact that I just shared one of these letters from the beginning of 1940, where Höffer writes in, not letters, of these diary entries, where he writes that Hitler is a monster and we have to get rid of this being as soon as possible, and that he lied and all the things he promised were wrong. And he would just break with his promises, whatever just is what he likes to do at the moment. No principles at all. And so I got a real shitstorm from some friends. And this makes it even more urgent to bring out these things, because nobody of us is purely positive and purely good person. Everybody of us has the dark and the light, the bright side inside. And the only thing is that we can always fight to be a real character and to do the right things in the right moment, in whatever position we are. And even we needed people in a position with some little or not or very little power, also in such autocratic systems or terror systems, because these people could really save lives and could help other people. So it's not so easy at all. And so Paul Höffer basically was a totally positive figure. And now he's blamed as a Nazi composer simply because he lived there. He was not even a party member. He didn't write any music explicitly for the party. It was just some music which was somewhere in the gray field between. But now we have to think about Shostakovich or Prokofiev. But particularly Shostakovich, everybody knows he was an inner emigre, even if he could never say so and never write so in any diary. And even if Solomon Volkov's so-called testimony is simply a falsification. But nobody would discuss that Shostakovich was opposing the regime. So Paul Höffer was in the same position in Germany, and a fantastic composer, born 11 years before Shostakovich, in the same year as Paul Hindemith. He resisted, and he did what he could. And that is a real morally fantastic thing. So we need that, and we need that at all times, also particularly today when we go into such difficult times again, and nobody knows where these things shall end. So open your mouth wherever you can and speak out the truth, and of course do what you can to bring positive things into this life. And courage is not blind. I can do everything. The police will come and will pick you up immediately. So you have to think about what you do. But such people like Paul Höffer, we need them today. And they are a great hope. These kinds of. This is for my musician friends. Follow such a path. And don't speak just with this, what we call in German, gratis courage. Blaming these who are already blamed. And trying to please these who are already in the position to dictate. So let's see what everybody can do with it. You can look up, you will find almost nothing. You will find, I think, one piano piece by Paul Höffer is played by an amateur on YouTube. And so it seems he doesn't exist. But we will bring him back. Wish you all the best. Bye.